The hearing room froze. A U.S. Senator had just asked the man leading America's top law enforcement agency a question every eighth grader could answer. Have you even read the Constitution? It wasn't a gotcha moment or political theater, it was the kind of silence that only happens when something truly shocking unfolds. Because when FBI Director Patel couldn't clearly affirm one of the most basic principles in American law, due process, it sent chills through the chamber. The question wasn't about policy or partisanship, it was about the foundation of justice itself. Imagine that for a moment the person entrusted with protecting Americans couldn't explain the clause that guarantees their most sacred right, that no one can be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law.
Hey, we have to make sure that there's not an over-aggressive government in the future that deprives us of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And you're familiar that that applies to all persons in the United States.
Yes, Senator.
So there's been a lot of concern about the several hundred immigrants who were swept off the streets of America and sent to El Salvador without due process. And does that concern you?
Senator, I'm not in a position to comment on whether or not they were given or not given due process or are supposed to be afforded due process. All the FBI did and all the FBI will continue to do is arrest those that have violated the law.
Okay, but to arrest, you have to investigate. Have you launched an investigation of this violation of the Freedom Clause of the U.S. Constitution?
Senator, I don't know that I agree with your characterization.
Well, that was my first question, whether or not you agree with the Fifth Amendment and are prepared to defend it. It is your job to investigate crimes.
Yes, I agree with the Fifth Amendment. I agree with the entire Constitution, and the men and women at the FBI decide.
So are you going to launch an investigation of the reported violation of the due process of several hundred individuals?
Again, Senator, it's not for me to call the balls and strikes on it. The men and women at the FBI who are trained to open investigations will make those calls.
So you have no influence over whether an investigation is opened?
I have influence over it, but you're asking me a constitutional question. I'm not a constitutional scholar.
Well, it's actually not it's a question also of law.
But your position is that every one of those individuals is by constitutional right afforded due process. I don't know the answer to that. I'm telling you.
You haven't read the Constitution?
It
says all persons.
I've got it right here, but what you're saying is that every single one of the illegals that was sent down to El Salvador is supposed to be given due process pursuant.
Yeah, that's what the Constitution says. It says no person.
It doesn't say that.
It does say no person. Yeah, I'll encourage you to read it because it's also been affirmed by the Supreme Court repeatedly. In the case of Miranda versus Arizona, held the right of all individuals, regardless of citizenship status, the Supreme Court in Reno versus Flores. I mean, but it's the plain language of the Constitution. It concerns me that you're not familiar with the core concept of due process applying to all persons as written in black and white in the Constitution.
As the first public defender who's ever served at the FBI as its director, I am more aware of due process than any predecessor in my seat. You are delineating between removal proceedings and criminal acts. My job is to investigate criminal acts. That's what we do.
You are aware that the Fifth Amendment refers to taking away liberty, and when people are arrested on the street, detained and sent out of the country, that their liberty has been taken away.
Senator, that is a constitutional question that you are asking me to answer. It's not for me to answer.
The question has already been answered by the Supreme Court that they're protected, therefore it's a violation of law, and it's your responsibility to open an investigation, and you're saying today you will not do so?
I am not the agency involved in removal proceedings. That is a different branch of government.
So if an agency other than the FBI violates the law and the Constitution, you will not investigate because it's a different agency?
I will investigate every violation of law.
Well, but you just said you're not investigating.
No. You and I are in disagreement on what is a violation of law. I have yet to hear from the Supreme Court your position as you have adjudicated it.
Well, very, very interesting, because the Supreme Court's been very clear, and I had heard you were trained in the law, so I expected maybe you would try to uphold it. You also took an oath to the Constitution.
Thank you for the reminder.
Well, it's important to remind you, since you're apparently unfamiliar with the very...
That single exchange, Patel fumbling for words while Senator Jeff Merkley held up a pocket constitution, exposed something much deeper than one official's ignorance. It revealed how fragile the rule of law becomes when those in power forget what it stands for. And as Patel tried to dodge, redefine, and deflect, Merkley refused to let it go. Because this wasn't about one man, it was about whether America still honors the promises written in its founding document. But what led to this jaw-dropping confrontation? It began like any other budget hearing. Patel was there to defend the FBI's new spending plan, one that somehow managed to cut $500 million after requesting an increase just the day before. Senators pressed him for clarity, but his answers were slippery. Then Merkley shifted gears, moving away from money and straight into principle. "Director Patel, are you familiar with the Fifth Amendment?" The room quieted. Patel nodded vaguely, offering a lawyer's non-answer. "Yes, Senator." But that's when the senator dropped the hammer. He wasn't talking about abstract theory. He was talking about the hundreds of immigrants swept off U.S. streets and deported to El Salvador without hearings. No lawyers, no judges, no chance to plead their case. "Does that concern you?" Merkley asked. Patel hesitated. "I'm not in a position to comment on whether they were given or not given due process." The air shifted. Merkley's eyebrows rose. "Have you even read the Constitution?" What happened next was part legal lecture, part moral reckoning. Merkley reminded Patel and the entire room that the Fifth Amendment isn't optional. It's a guarantee. Ratified more than 230 years ago, it was written to stop exactly this kind of government overreach. And it doesn't say citizens, it says no person. That choice of words was deliberate. It means everyone, citizen or not, is entitled to fairness before the law. Patel tried to recover. He argued it wasn't his place to decide such things, that deportations fell under another agency. But that excuse didn't hold up. The senator pressed harder, pointing out Supreme Court rulings, Miranda v. Arizona, Reno v. Flores, cases that made it clear true process applies to all persons within U.S. borders. And yet the FBI director, the supposed guardian of law and order, seemed unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that fact. Merkley's frustration was palpable. This wasn't a partisan attack, it was disbelief. He leaned forward and said, "It concerns me that you're not familiar with the core concept of due process applying to all persons as written in black and white in the Constitution." Patel's response sealed the moment in history. "As the first public defender to serve as FBI director, I'm more aware of due process than any predecessor. But my job is to investigate criminal acts." That was the tell. Patel was hiding behind bureaucracy, reducing a moral obligation to a procedural checklist. Merkley didn't miss it. When people are arrested, detained, or sent out of the country, their liberty is taken away. That is a matter of due process. Patel dodged again. "That's not for me to answer." At that point, the senator looked exhausted, not angry, but disappointed. Because this wasn't about technicalities, it was about principle. The head of the FBI was refusing to acknowledge a constitutional truth so simple that every law student learns it on day one. That moment, Patel clutching the Constitution and saying, "I have it right here," while still misunderstanding its meaning, summed up the entire exchange. It's one thing to hold the Constitution, it's another to uphold it. Merkley's voice cut through the tension. "It says all persons. I encourage you to read it." You could feel the weight of those words, not as an insult but as a warning. Because every time a leader treats constitutional rights like optional guidelines, democracy erodes a little more. And here was the terrifying part. This wasn't theoretical. These weren't imaginary violations. People, real human beings, had been taken from their homes and deported without a hearing. That's not a procedural glitch. That's a moral failure. When those in power stop seeing individuals as persons with rights and start seeing them as numbers or cases, that's when democracy begins to rot from the inside. This was bigger than one official's stumble. It was a reflection of something systemic. The FBI director's words revealed how easily justice can be buried under red tape. "Not my responsibility. Not my department. Not my authority." It's the language of evasion, the same kind of phrasing used throughout history when institutions look the other way. When the government starts saying that's someone else's job, it creates a vacuum where accountability should be. And that's how power abuses grow, slowly, quietly, behind procedural excuses. Merkley knew it. That's why he didn't let go. He wasn't just interrogating Patel, he was confronting a mindset that's infected every level of bureaucracy, the idea that protecting rights is optional. And as Patel doubled down on his evasions, the senator's tone shifted from lawyerly to moral. Will you make sure that due process in every action of the FBI is completely honored under your time as director? Patel paused, then gave the only answer he could true.
Sure.
It was the weakest yes imaginable. Outside the hearing, clips of the exchange began circulating online. People across the political spectrum were stunned, not because of partisan outrage, but because of disbelief. How could the director of the FBI not confidently affirm the Fifth Amendment? How could someone sworn to support and defend the Constitution treat one of its most basic guarantees like a debate prompt? Merkley's questioning didn't just expose Patel's uncertainty, it exposed the quiet decay of constitutional literacy in power itself. We live in an era where public officials can quote the Constitution for applause lines but ignore its meaning when it's inconvenient. They wave it around, claim to honor it, but when asked to apply it, suddenly, it's complicated. And that's exactly why this moment struck a nerve. Because when someone as powerful as the FBI director sidesteps the Constitution, it raises a terrifying question: who then is protecting it? But the story doesn't end there. The deeper issue isn't that Patel stumbled, it's that we've normalized leaders doing so. We expect political spin, bureaucratic language and evasive answers, but we shouldn't accept ignorance of the very document that defines their authority. The Fifth Amendment isn't a suggestion, it's the line between democracy and tyranny, between justice and abuse, between a government that serves its people and one that controls them. When Merkley said, "That's what the Constitution says, I encourage you to read it," he wasn't just talking to Patel, he was talking to everyone watching. Because the erosion of rights doesn't happen in a single moment, it happens gradually, every time an official dodges accountability. Every time a citizen stops paying attention, every time we accept "not my job" as an answer. And that's why Merkley's stand mattered. It wasn't grandstanding, it was a line in the sand. If you strip away the politics, what you're left with is a moral truth. The Constitution is only as strong as those who are willing to defend it. Patel may not have violated the law that day, but he violated something deeper: the public's faith in the guardians of justice. Because when those sworn to protect rights can't articulate them, it sends a message that those rights are negotiable. That's how democracies die, not with a coup, but with indifference. With leaders who say "I have it right here" but never open it. And that's why this hearing matters. It's not about one exchange or one agency. It's about whether the people who hold the most power in America still believe in the document that limits it. The Constitution doesn't just restrain the government, it defines who we are as a nation. It's the moral contract between the people and those who govern them. If that contract becomes meaningless, if it's treated like a prop, then every right we take for granted becomes fragile. So what should happen next? Patel's stumble should spark something far bigger than outrage. It should force every official, every agency, every citizen to re-examine what those 52 words in the Fifth Amendment really mean. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Those words are simple, but they are everything. They mean that power has limits. They mean that fairness isn't conditional, and they mean that even when it's inconvenient, the government must answer to the law, not the other way around. If that principle fades, so does democracy. And maybe that's the real wake-up call from this hearing, not just for the FBI, but for all of us. Because protecting freedom isn't someone else's job, it's everyone's. The Constitution doesn't survive by being quoted, it survives by being lived. So the next time a leader holds it up like a badge of honor, remember the real question isn't whether they can recite it, it's whether they believe in it. If you believe in that, if you think accountability still matters, then don't just scroll past moments like this. Stay engaged, stay aware, because understanding these hearings isn't about partisanship, it's about defending the very idea of America. And if you're with us in that fight, make sure you hit subscribe, tap like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next moment that exposes how power really works and how ordinary people can still hold it accountable. Because justice doesn't defend itself, we do.